It was 1959. A CIA briefing room in Langley hummed with the controlled anxiety of men who believed they had solved an impossible problem. The U-2 spy plane had been penetrating Soviet airspace for 3 years, without a single loss, photographing missile installations and military facilities from an altitude no Soviet interceptor could reach. Senior analyst Richard Bissell sat at the head of the conference table, reviewing the latest intelligence on Soviet air defenses. What he didn't know was that somewhere in the Urals, Soviet engineers had just solved the equation that would make his perfect aircraft vulnerable. The question that would define the next 5 years of Cold War intelligence was deceptively simple. How do you shoot down an aircraft flying at 70,000 feet when your fastest interceptors stall at 55,000? The answer was waiting in the form of a missile system so revolutionary it would transform every assumption about air defense, satellite, reconnaissance, and the future of Cold War technology. But the Americans didn't see it coming, and when it would arrive with a sound like the end of American technological dominance over Soviet airspace. If you're interested in the hidden weapons race that shaped the Cold War, hit subscribe. We're diving into the moment when Soviet persistence finally overtook American complacency. The U-2 program represented the pinnacle of American intelligence-gathering ambition in the mid-1950s. Lockheed's Kelly Johnson had designed an aircraft so radical that it violated every principle of conventional aeronautics. Instead of speed, he chose altitude. Instead of maneuverability, he chose endurance. The U-2 was essentially a sailplane with a jet engine, light enough to climb to 70,000 feet.
Gentlemen, the
and
situation requires
fuel-efficient enough
immediate
to stay
attention.
there
We
for
must
9
proceed with the
hours.
outlined strategy.
The first operational overflight crossed Soviet airspace on July 4, 1956, from West Germany toward Moscow. CIA planners believed the Soviets either couldn't see the aircraft or couldn't reach it. They were wrong on both counts. Soviet radar operators tracked the U-2 perfectly. They just couldn't do anything about it. Every fighter scramble fell short. Every attempted interception failed. The radar operators watched helplessly as American pilots photographed their country from an altitude where no Soviet weapon could touch them. By 1959, the CIA had flown dozens of U-2 missions deep into Soviet territory. Each mission photographed hundreds of miles of sensitive targets. Each mission returned safely. The pattern had become so reliable that CIA planners began discussing the end of the program as a possibility. Why risk it when you had a perfect intelligence source that the Soviets couldn't stop? That confidence was about to become catastrophically misplaced. In the Soviet Union, the failure to intercept the U-2 had triggered an urgent reassessment of air defense doctrine. Soviet Air Defense Commander Sergei Biryuzov convened emergency meetings with missile designers, radar specialists, and interceptor pilots. The consensus was bleak. The existing S-75 Divina missile system could theoretically engage targets at 65,000 feet, but only in ideal conditions against stationary targets. Against a maneuvering aircraft at 70,000 feet, the kill probability was essentially zero. Soviet missile designer Pyotr Grushin received the order in early 1958. Develop a modification to the S-75 that could reliably intercept high-altitude targets. Grushin's team at OKB-2 began systematic analysis of every U-2 overflight. They studied radar tracking data. They examined photographs of U-2 contrails. They calculated velocity profiles and turn rates. Every piece of information about the American aircraft became part of the engineering solution. The breakthrough came from a counterintuitive insight. Instead of trying to make the missile faster or give it more altitude capability, Grushin's team focused on making it smarter. They developed a new guidance system that could maintain lock on small, high-altitude targets in the thin stratosphere where earlier radars lost signal. They created a proximity fuse that detonated the warhead when passing within 150 feet of the target, rather than requiring a direct hit. They optimized the warhead for the stratospheric environment where blast pressure was minimal but fragmentation velocity was devastating. The modified S-75M system entered limited production in 1950. The improvements were significant but not revolutionary. The missile climbed slightly faster. The radar had better high-altitude discrimination. The warhead was more lethal at extreme altitude. But the real advantage was organizational. Soviet Air Defense Command developed a new tactical doctrine that used multiple missile batteries firing in coordinated salvos, creating overlapping kill zones that made evasion statistically impossible. American intelligence agencies knew the Soviets were improving their air defenses. Spy satellites had photographed expanded missile deployments. Signals intelligence had intercepted new communications protocols. But CIA analysts dismissed the threat. The U-2 could climb to 70,000 feet in 12 minutes. Soviet fighters couldn't reach that altitude. Improved missiles might threaten lower-altitude aircraft, but not the U-2. The assumption was elegant and completely wrong. What the CIA didn't understand was that Soviet designers had accepted a fundamental trade-off. Earlier missiles needed near-perfect intercept geometry. The new system didn't. It could fire from positions that gave poor initial geometry because the coordinated salvo approach meant multiple missiles would create a statistically overwhelming intercept probability. If one missile missed, another would get close enough. If two missed, the third would be lethal. It was a brute force solution to a precision problem. By early 1960s, Soviet Air Defense Command had positioned S-75M batteries along all suspected U-2 flight corridors. The most experienced crews were selected for the sensitive assignments. They conducted constant training exercises, practicing intercept profiles against simulated high-altitude targets. They studied weather patterns to optimize radar performance. They analyzed U-2 flight characteristics to predict likely routes and altitudes. CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized one final deep overflight before the planned cancellation of the U-2 program. The mission, codenamed Operation Grand Slam, would photograph the Soviet ICBM test facility at Tyuratam, the most sensitive military installation in the Soviet Union. The aircraft selected was one of the newest U-2C variants, equipped with the most advanced camera system ever deployed. The pilot was Francis Gary Powers, one of the most experienced U-2 pilots in the CIA's inventory. Powers climbed into his aircraft at Peshawar Air Base, in Pakistan on the morning of May 1, 1960. His pressure suit was already uncomfortable in the heat. His navigation charts showed a route that would take him across Soviet airspace for over 3 hours, photographing some of the most heavily defended territory in the world. The mission was supposed to be routine. Every previous deep overflight had succeeded. Why would this one be different? Powers lifted off at 6:26 a.m. He climbed through the troposphere into the stratosphere, the cockpit temperature dropping to minus 70 degrees Celsius despite the heating systems. At 70,000 feet, he leveled off and engaged the autopilot. For the first 90 minutes of his mission, everything proceeded according to plan. His cameras photographed the airfield at Tyuratam. He turned northeast toward his next target. Soviet radar operators tracked his progress with precision. At the Sverdlovsk Air Defense Sector, Major Mikhail Voronov watched the U-2 enter his coverage zone. Unlike the confusion and desperation of earlier intercept attempts, this time he had a coordinated battle plan. 4 S-75M batteries had been positioned specifically for this target. Their radars were locked on. Their crews were standing by. The missile officers had their firing solutions calculated. Voronov gave the order to launch. The first salvo of 3 S-75M missiles climbed almost vertically from their launch sites. They accelerated to Mach 3 as their motors burned. At 65,000 feet, their sustainer motors burned out and the guidance systems took control. The missiles began following the radar steering commands, climbing into the rarefied air of the stratosphere where no aircraft had ever been successfully engaged before. Powers saw nothing from his cockpit. The missiles were invisible against the dark sky above him. He was aware that Soviet air defenses were tracking him. CIA briefings had warned him that improved air defense systems were being deployed, but previous overflights had shown that Soviet interceptors couldn't reach his altitude. Why would missiles be any different? The first salvo passed 3,000 feet below his aircraft, missing by the margin that had always kept him safe in previous flights. Powers felt the shock wave, a sudden turbulence that made him check his instruments. Everything still seemed normal. The aircraft was climbing slightly to compensate. His cameras were still photographing. His fuel consumption was on schedule. But the Sverdlovsk air defense sector was already launching the second salvo. These 3 missiles were fired from a battery positioned 40 miles ahead of Powers' aircraft on his projected flight path. They climbed with the same aggressive profile as the first salvo, reaching the stratosphere before beginning their guidance phase. The missile officers had calculated their intercept point to occur directly in front of the U-2, forcing Powers to either fly through an explosion or attempt evasive, maneuvers that would make his cameras unusable. The third salvo launched 5 minutes later from a battery to the north. 9 missiles now climbed toward the U-2 corridor, creating a 3-dimensional kill zone that Powers couldn't escape without abandoning his mission. The second salvo detonated first, exploding 500 feet ahead of the U-2. Powers pushed the control stick forward to dive beneath the blast, but at 70,000 feet, the thin air gave the aircraft almost no control authority. The stick moved, but the aircraft barely responded. He was essentially flying a glider, and no glider could maneuver in that thin stratosphere. 1 missile from the second salvo passed 150 feet from Powers' right wing. Its proximity fuse detected the U-2 and detonated the warhead. The explosion in the thin air was barely visible, almost anticlimactic. But the warhead had released 70 pounds of high explosive fragments accelerated to 20,000 feet per second by the blast. The shrapnel tore into the U-2's fuselage like a broadside from a warship. The right wing was shredded. The fuselage was punctured in a dozen places. The engine began losing power. Hydraulic fluid sprayed from ruptured lines. Within seconds, the aircraft that had been untouchable for 4 years became a falling wreck. Powers reached for his ejection handle but hesitated. The aircraft was diving steeply, and ejecting from a diving aircraft at 70,000 feet was dangerous even in ideal circumstances. He tried to regain control, pulling back on the stick to level the wings. For a moment, it worked. Then the left wing separated completely from the fuselage. Powers ejected at 64,000 feet. His pressure suit kept him alive in an environment that would otherwise kill in 15 seconds. He tumbled through the stratosphere, his parachute still packed in its container. At 15,000 feet, he pulled the ripcord. The parachute opened, and he began, drifting down toward a Soviet landscape that had just witnessed the end of American air superiority. Soviet air defense crews watched their radar screens light up with a new contact descending rapidly from altitude. The U-2 was gone. The missiles had worked. After 4 years of failures, after hundreds of attempted intercepts that ended in frustration, the Soviet air defense system had finally succeeded. On the ground near the village of Kosalino, local militia found Powers hanging in his parachute. He was captured within hours. The wreckage of his aircraft was secured by Soviet troops. The camera survived largely intact. The film was recovered. Moscow had not only shot down the impossible aircraft, they had captured its pilot and its secrets. The news reached Langley 9 hours later through radio intercepts. CIA Director Alan Dulles received the initial report with disbelief. It wasn't possible. The U-2 was invulnerable. The altitude advantage was absolute. No Soviet missile could reach that high with enough precision to be lethal, but it had. Within 24 hours, KGB officers had learned the essentials from Powers under interrogation. The U-2 had been hit by a missile. The aircraft had broken up. The pilot had ejected successfully. Khrushchev was informed of the success within hours. Soviet Premier Khrushchev authorized the immediate announcement of the shootdown, presenting it as a triumph of Soviet engineering over American arrogance. President Eisenhower initially authorized a cover story claiming that a weather research aircraft had accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. The story was technically false but strategically safer than admitting to an espionage operation. The CIA prepared public statements defending the U-2 program. Dulles briefed congressional leaders on the loss. Then Khrushchev made his next move. He revealed that Powers was alive. He revealed that the Soviets had recovered the camera. He announced that they would try Powers publicly for espionage. The cover story collapsed. The CIA had been caught red-handed running a reconnaissance operation over the Soviet heartland. The political damage was immediate and severe. A planned Paris summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev was canceled. Soviet representatives walked out of disarmament negotiations. The incident became a propaganda victory that Moscow exploited relentlessly. Soviet media showed photographs of the U-2 wreckage. The camera and film were displayed at exhibitions. Powers stood trial in Moscow, admitting his role in the espionage operation. But the strategic impact went far deeper than propaganda. The shootdown proved that altitude alone was no longer absolute protection. It demonstrated that Soviet persistence and systematic engineering could overcome American technological advantages. It validated the Soviet approach to military development. Accept temporary inferiority, document the gap systematically, and commit to closing it. Through iteration. For American intelligence, the implications were profound. The U-2 had been conceived as an untouchable reconnaissance platform. That conception was now obsolete. The CIA accelerated the development of satellite reconnaissance systems that truly were untouchable, because they orbited above the atmosphere entirely. The Corona satellite program, which had been struggling for funding and political support, suddenly became the highest priority intelligence collection platform. Within 3 years, Corona satellites would provide better imagery than U-2 aircraft ever could. The transition from aircraft to space-based reconnaissance happened faster than anyone in the CIA had anticipated, driven by the urgent need to replace the U-2 with a system the Soviets couldn't shoot down. Soviet Air Defense Command, meanwhile, had proven a critical doctrine. Multiple missiles firing in coordinated salvos could create kill zones against even the most difficult targets. That doctrine would be refined and expanded throughout the Cold War. Every subsequent air defense system would be built on the principle that quantity of fire could overcome quality of evasion. The next generation of American reconnaissance aircraft, the SR-71 Blackbird, was designed with this lesson in mind. It would fly faster and higher than the U-2, reaching Mach 3.2 and 85,000 feet. But speed and altitude alone wouldn't be sufficient. The aircraft would also be designed to evade missiles through maneuver, reducing its radar cross-section through stealth shaping, and deploying electronic countermeasures that confused missile guidance systems. Powers spent 21 months in Soviet custody before being exchanged for KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel in February 1962. He returned to a mixed reception in America. Some viewed him as a victim of Cold War espionage. Others questioned why he hadn't destroyed his aircraft or activated the suicide pill that all U-2 pilots carried. He eventually became a test pilot and later a traffic reporter for a Los Angeles radio station. He died in a helicopter crash in 1977. The U-2 continued flying reconnaissance missions, but only over countries with less advanced air defenses. The aircraft never again penetrated deep into Soviet airspace at 70,000 feet. That chapter of Cold War history closed when the S-75M missile finally reached the high-altitude corridor that had seemed untouchable for so long. If you're still watching, you understand how the Cold War operated at the intersection of technology and human judgment. The CIA was right about the U-2's technical capabilities. They were catastrophically wrong about Soviet air defense evolution. Subscribe for more stories about the weapons, the decisions, and the moments when certainty turned to vulnerability. The Sverdlovsk shootdown represented a turning point in Cold War intelligence collection methodology. For the first time, a technological advantage had been negated not through revolutionary innovation, but through systematic improvement and coordinated deployment. Soviet engineers hadn't invented anything fundamentally new. They had optimized existing technology, deployed it intelligently, and achieved success through persistence. American analysts studying the shootdown documented the key factors that made the intercept successful. The improved proximity fuse had detonated within 150 feet of the U-2, far too close to survive. The coordinated salvo approach had created overlapping kill zones that made evasion impossible. The tactical doctrine of positioning multiple batteries on predicted flight paths had ensured that no matter which route Powers chose, he would encounter engaging missiles. The most crucial factor, however, was timing. The S-75M system had been operational for only 6 months when Powers was shot down. If he had flown his mission 6 months earlier, before the improved system was deployed, he would have completed the overflight successfully. If he had flown 6 months later, the CIA might have suspended U-2 operations preemptively based on new intelligence about Soviet capabilities. Powers' shootdown occurred in the narrow window between Soviet capability and American awareness. That timing window would become a recurring theme in Cold War intelligence collection. Every new reconnaissance system would be vulnerable to that same timing gap. The period between when an adversary developed a counter to the system and when the intelligence community recognized the threat. The CIA's response was to accelerate satellite reconnaissance development, but satellites brought their own vulnerabilities. They followed predictable orbital tracks that ground stations could calculate precisely. They passed over specific targets at specific times. An adversary could hide sensitive activities during satellite overpass windows. The U-2 had offered unpredictability. Satellites offered survivability, but at the cost of tactical flexibility. Soviet Air Defense Command used the victory at Sverdlovsk to reshape their entire doctrine. If missiles could bring down the fastest, highest-flying American reconnaissance aircraft, then perhaps they could bring down anything. Investment in air defense systems accelerated. The S-75 became the template for an entire family of missile systems. Training became more intensive. Doctrine became more sophisticated. The irony is that despite their success in shooting down Powers, the Soviets couldn't prevent the satellite reconnaissance that ultimately replaced the U-2. American satellites photographed Soviet military installations with such precision that the U-2's advantages became unnecessary. The ICBM gap that had driven so much Cold War anxiety turned out to be largely fictional, a product of overestimated Soviet capabilities that satellite imagery quickly disproved. By 1962, satellite reconnaissance had revealed that the Soviets had deployed relatively few ICBMs, far fewer than CIA estimates had suggested. This intelligence shaped American strategic decisions for the remainder of the Cold War. The victory at Sverdlovsk had been tactically brilliant, but strategically irrelevant. By the time the Soviets proved they could shoot down high-altitude aircraft, the Americans had already moved on to reconnaissance platforms the Soviets couldn't touch. The lesson that both superpowers learned was that technical advantage is always temporary. The Americans built an aircraft that seemed untouchable. The Soviets learned to touch it. The Americans built satellites that truly were untouchable. The Soviets could only watch, but that didn't mean they accepted permanent inferiority. They continued investing in air defense systems, developing missiles that could eventually threaten satellites themselves. Major Mikhail Voronov, who coordinated the Sverdlovsk intercept, became a hero in Soviet military circles. He received the Order of Lenin and was promoted to higher command. His name appeared in official histories of Soviet air defense. But the radar operators and missile crews who actually fired the missiles received commendations and modest bonuses. The victory belonged to the system, not to any individual. The legacy of May 1, 1960 extended far beyond that single shootdown. It validated the Soviet approach to military development and encouraged investment in air defense systems that would persist throughout the Cold War. It demonstrated to American policymakers that technological superiority was contingent and could be negated by patient engineering. It accelerated the transition to space-based reconnaissance that would define intelligence collection for the next half-century. It also created a diplomatic crisis that shaped the remainder of Eisenhower's presidency. The canceled Paris summit represented a lost opportunity for arms control negotiations. The propaganda victory for the Soviet Union created international perception that American technological dominance was cracking. The trial of Francis Gary Powers became a symbol of Cold War espionage and the risks of covert intelligence operations. The question that haunted American intelligence agencies after the shootdown was simple but profound. If the Soviets could negate the U-2's advantage through patient engineering, what other advantages were vulnerable to similar negation? The answer led to a fundamental shift in how the CIA approached reconnaissance. Multiple collection systems became preferable to any single system. Technical advantages needed built-in obsolescence, recognizing that they would eventually be countered. Intelligence analysis needed to account for adversary learning and innovation, rather than assuming technological advantages were permanent. The stunned CIA analysts who learned that the U-2 had been shot down experienced a moment of reckoning that shaped Cold War intelligence practice for decades. They had been too confident in technical advantage. They had dismissed warnings about Soviet air defense improvements. They had failed to account for the possibility that systematic engineering could overcome their technological edge. That lesson would not be forgotten. Every subsequent intelligence collection program would be developed with the assumption that it would eventually be countered. Every technological advantage would be treated as temporary. Every assessment of adversary capabilities would account for the possibility that the adversary had identified vulnerabilities and was working to exploit them. The S-75M missile that killed Powers' U-2 became a symbol of Soviet persistence. It wasn't revolutionary, it was evolutionary. It wasn't an innovation, it was optimization. It proved that dedication to closing a technical gap could succeed even against superior technology. That principle would guide Soviet military development throughout the Cold War and would influence other nations' approaches to military competition. If you appreciate these deep analyses of Cold War technical decisions and their strategic consequences, subscribe now. We're exploring the moments when human judgment, technical capability, and strategic consequence intersected to reshape the Cold War. The final irony is that both superpowers were correct in their assessments of what had happened. The Soviets were right that they had developed a system capable of defeating the U-2 at extreme altitude. The Americans were right that satellites would provide better reconnaissance anyway. The victory at Sverdlovsk was tactically decisive, but strategically marginal. By the time the Soviets proved they could shoot down high-altitude manned aircraft, manned reconnaissance was already becoming obsolete. Francis Gary Powers lived another 17 years after his exchange, never quite escaping the shadow of being the pilot whose aircraft was shot down. He became a symbol of the risks of espionage and the price of Cold War competition. But his shootdown also became a turning point, the moment when everyone understood that technological advantage was contingent and that persistence could overcome superiority. The radar operators at Sverdlovsk who directed that intercept never became famous. Their names don't appear in most histories of the Cold War, but they participated in a moment that changed how superpowers approached military competition. They proved that careful analysis of technical problems could yield engineering solutions that seemed impossible. They demonstrated that coordinated fire could overcome superior evasion. That's the lesson from the S-75M missile reaching the U-2 corridor in May 1960. In the Cold War, no advantage lasts forever when your opponent refuses to accept defeat. The Americans built an untouchable aircraft. The Soviets learned to touch it. And in doing so, they changed the technological race that would define the remaining decades of the Cold War.